Well, I mean, if only Mr Williamson had taken a call, we could have heard a little bit more about what he meant when he said a little bit of slash and burn never hurt anyone, because that's really the National Party's agenda when it comes to tertiary education. I've got respect for Mr Williamson. He says what he thinks. He says what the National Party really thinks. A little bit of slash and burn never hurt anyone. Well, we've certainly seen a little bit of slash and burn in the tertiary sector, and I think we're going to see a little bit more to come. Mr Speaker, the Labour Party does support this bill because it is largely a technical bill, although I admit, as the previous speaker said, there are some important elements in that in terms of the exemptions, particularly around the idea of people who are studying overseas on exchanges or scholarships. I think this is a good thing. It will allow people to continue their education in a way that New Zealand will benefit from. We will come back in the committee stages to some of the technical amendments, particularly the one around the changes to penalties, and I understand the Green Party's position on that, and I'd like to raise a few questions with the Minister about how information will be communicated to borrowers so that they know about the increased penalty rates. That's been one of the major issues for people when they've been going overseas, not always understanding what requirements they have as borrowers, and I think it'll be very important if we are going to take a more punitive stance there that our borrowers know what they're going to be doing. Also around the hardship grounds, I think it's potentially quite a good thing that's been done there, but we need to understand fully how that's going to work as well. Another one of the technical amendments is very technical. It's shifting the setting of the interest rate from regulations to the actual Act. Now, this seems like a minor amendment, but there are some questions to be raised about that, particularly in light of what happened this year with the setting of the interest rate, and we just want to make sure that we're clear on how that will work. So they are technical matters, and they do tidy up some elements of the Act and the scheme and its working, and we are pleased to support that. But, Mr Speaker, it's difficult for us to stand here and be completely comfortable when it comes to talking about student loans and this government. Because what we have heard in recent weeks with the appointment of Stephen Joyce as the Minister is an absolute acknowledgement that National has never had a commitment to the interest-free student loan scheme. Stephen Joyce said it in the press last Saturday. It was a political call to take on the interest-free student loan scheme. And those of us who were around about the time that Labor brought in the interest-free student loan scheme are not surprised to hear that, Mr Speaker, because at the time it was introduced, John Key, who was then, I think, the finance spokesperson for the National Party, he said he would oppose interest-free student loans with every bone in his body. Every bone in his body he would oppose it. Well, there can't be many bones at all. Spineless, some might say, but not many bones at all. If he said, he told this House, this very House, he would oppose interest-free student loans with every bone in his body, but a political call came along and National adopted it. But we know there's no commitment to it, because both Mr Key and Mr Joyce in recent weeks have said that things need to be looked at with the student loan scheme. There need to be changes. And Mr Speaker, in the Prime Minister's statement to Parliament, he actually made clear that he wanted to tighten up the rules around access to student loans. And he talked in particular about people who may not be passing their courses, and another very worrying phrase about people who weren't moving into work quickly enough. And we on this side of the House want to know what that means, because what that sounds like is a huge restriction on the ability of people to undertake multiple courses, perhaps change tack partway through a course. Not everybody arrives at tertiary study instantly ready, knowing what they want to do for the rest of their lives. We need to invest in education and allow people to develop their skills. And any tightening of the student loan scheme, any limiting of people's access to student loans, which is what the Prime Minister was talking about in his statement to Parliament, that will be detrimental to New Zealand's future. And the government really does need to explain where it's heading with student loans. Mr Speaker, Stephen Joyce is a man who I respect. He clearly has a good and quick understanding of how politics works, and he's come into Parliament as a senior minister. But he has said some things which I think belie the fact that perhaps he doesn't understand the student loan scheme properly. He said in the press last weekend, the simple point is, if you don't pay interest on any loan, forget student loans for a second, then there is less incentive to pay it back if you do pay interest. The thing that Mr Joyce leaves out is that student loans automatically deduct from your salary once you earn more than $19,000 a year at 10%. That's the incentive. The law gives the incentive. And what it appears here is happening here is that Stephen Joyce, taking on this role, is looking to wind back elements of the interest-free student loan scheme before I predict in the future they will attempt to wind the whole scheme back. And we've heard phrases coming out of the National Party about the generosity of taxpayers. That phrase was used by John Key in his speech to Parliament. Louise Upston used it before. This is the beginning of trying to say that students don't deserve interest-free student loans. Well, what we know, and in fact what's actually implicit in this bill, is that the purpose of interest-free student loans, in large part, was to encourage people to stay in New Zealand. And that's in fact completely understood by this bill, because we're extending that out to people from other territories, from Niue and the Cook Islands and Tokelau, and anyone in the Ross dependency as well. So we're actually acknowledging that interest-free student loans are good in terms of the policy objective of keeping people in New Zealand and encouraging them to stay and contribute to our economy. Now, National rejected that as a reasoning for interest-free student loans when they were first brought in. But this bill recognises that actually that's an important part of developing our economy and making sure that people do stay here and contribute to our economy. And that will be undermined, Mr Speaker, if the National Party goes ahead with starting to restrict access to student loans and wind back the interest-free policy that they have never been committed to. A political call, a policy they were going to oppose with every bone in their body, and now forced into it for electoral reasons, they look to slowly but surely undermine that policy. And Mr Speaker, we on this side of the House will not stand up for that. Mr Speaker, we've had some comments from the other side of the House about the importance of education and National's understanding of the importance of investing in tertiary education. But if we look at National's record on tertiary education, there is no sign of that. Mr Nash has already spoken about the removal of the training incentive allowance. The last budget took $60 million out of our polytechs at the very time that they were necessary and important in giving people skills during the recession. If we look across the Tasman, something I know that the National Party is very fond of doing, we will see over there that in Australia's response to the recession, they invested in skills and technology. They made sure that people had access to the equivalent of polytechnics free if they lost their jobs. That was a bold move to ensure that people kept up their skills in the recession and were able to contribute to the economy when they came back, when the recession lessened. What we have from the National Party is in fact no investment in the tertiary sector. Where's the plan to say tertiary institutions are bursting at the seams, which they are? Where's the plan to say we'll actually lift the cap? We'll actually lift the cap because circumstances dictate that we want people to be training so that they can contribute to the economy. We have seen nothing of that. We have simply seen a consistent undermining of the tertiary sector, taking away community roles on polytechnic councils and not investing in the future of New Zealand. Mr Speaker, while we support this bill because it does include some important technical changes, we are very wary of the direction of the National Party on student loans, very wary that they will undermine interest-free student loans, a policy that is important to our economy and important to our future.
I call